Welcome to Discograffiti's 2025 Patreon membership superdrive. Now more than ever with our Beach Boys series underway, much of which will be living exclusively on our Patreon platform, this is the time to join, and I'm going to make it super easy for you. At the lieutenant or major tier, in addition to 3 or 4 shows a week, access to the gigantic archive of Patreon back episodes, and your backstage pass, you'll also get the following: an onboarding call with me during which you'll tell me all your ideas on how to make the podcast you'd like to hear. And whether I use all, some, or none of your ideas, I'll have listened closely and most importantly, gotten to know you. Plus, 3 months into your membership, you'll be eligible to appear on the Discograffiti Soldiers of Sound podcast. That's right, an entire episode all about you, your band, your band's album, your band's tour, or whatever other cool stuff you might be up to. And not only do we make the episode, we promote it for you too. Last but not least, you'll receive a completely free digital copy of Metal Machine Muzak, which otherwise costs $11. Metal Machine Muzak is Discograffiti's double album Lou Reed tribute featuring 16-minute pieces by Lou Barlow from Sebado and Dino Jr., Corey Hansen from Wand, Mark Robinson from Unrest, and W. Cullen Hart from Olivia Tremor Control. Please tell all your music-obsessive friends. In fact, if your friends do sign up, be sure to email me at info@discograffiti.com and let me know who they are, because I'll be sending you an additional surprise gift on top of everything else as a token of my gratitude. And now, without further ado, the greatest music commentary podcast in all the land, I bring you Discograffiti.
Denny's drums, the way it was inspirational to me, I got to think it held the same feeling for a lot of other aspiring drummers and musicians when it came out. You know, the fact that one of the members could step out stark naked like that and play his instrument, I think spoke to a lot of kids too.
Welcome to another episode of Discograffiti's wildly in-depth Beach Boys series, And Your Dreams Come True, where Brian Wilson freaks like you and me get our chance to delve deep into the barely believable history and prodigious discography of my favorite band of all time, and also coincidentally the best, along with a slew of over 45 top-shelf guests, ranging from musicians inspired by their work, family members, documentary directors, songwriting collaborators, Beach Boys authors, producers, touring band members, and for good measure, some of the Beach Boys themselves. I'm your host, Dave Gebrow, and special thanks goes out to Jeff McAvoy and especially co-producer Dennis Diken, without whom this series would not have happened. And in this episode, we'll be turning our spray cans on the Beach Boys' 5th album, Shutdown Volume 2, along with our special guest, the Smithereens Dennis Diken. Here's just a few of the many things that Dennis and I discuss in this podcast. The real-life story that inspired Brian Wilson to write Help Me Ronda, how Murry wound up getting sacked and the familiar way in which he dealt with it, whether Warmth of the Sun foretold JFK's assassination or offered a fresh tribute to it, a friendly argument over whether or not the record falls apart toward the end, and an incredible cameo by Russ Titelman, who clarifies how Fun came to be. If you're a Beach Boys superfan like me, you'll want to turn this free version off right now and opt for the director's cut of this episode on our Patreon page, which features 17 additional minutes of essential material. And you can find it in our Patreon shop for mere pennies at patreon.com/discograffiti/shop. Or better yet, just subscribe for access to the complete versions of all our shows. I recommend the lieutenant tier at the very least, so you can access those director's cuts, but the major tier is what you want if you want it all. Even if you're on the fence, just head over there because it's finally free to become a basic member. Coming up, we've got Al Jardine, Marilyn Wilson, Don Was, Ginger Blake, Pete Buck, Ira Kaplan from Yo La Tengo, The Cars' Elliot Easton, Sonic Boom, Don Fleming, Marshall Crenshaw, Russ Titelman, Jerry Schilling, Greg Jacobson, Christian Love, Gary Griffin, David Beard, Probing Gregory, John Cowsill, David Leaf, Don Randy, Rob Bonfilio, Wyatt Funderburk, Stephen Kalinich, Matt Jardine, Fred Vale, Sam Parker, Brent Wilson, Mark Lynette, Alan Boyd, Carly Minoz, and many more. So don't miss out. Open up your listening app right now and subscribe. And away we go then. Today's guest is a drummer, DJ, author, music historian, and founding member of the Smithereens. He's been a constant member of the band since 1980, but has also found consistent work as a session drummer since then as well. He's recorded or toured with, amongst so many others, Ronnie Spector, Dave Davies, Nancy Sinatra, Mary Weiss of the Shangri-Las, Joey Ramone, R. Stevie Moore, Jeffrey Foskett, and Benny King. On December 18th, 2015, during a Dave Davies show in London, it was he at the kit, while Ray Davies joined his brother on stage for You Really Got Me. It was the first time the two Kings had performed together in nearly 2 decades, and this man was the glue. His album Late Music arrived in 2009, featuring Andy Paley, Jason Faulkner, and the Honeys on backing vocals. As a liner notes author and reissue project researcher, this man's contributed to numerous compilation albums, including collections of The Four Freshmen, Louis Prima, The Lovin' Spoonful, The Four Seasons, and The Beach Boys. He's had articles published in USA Today and EQ magazine, has contributed to the Billboard Encyclopedia of Record Producers, and been a fill-in DJ on WFMU. He's also a co-producer on this series that you're currently enjoying, Discograffiti's The Beach Boys and Your Dreams Come True. And when I say I couldn't have done it without him, I really, really mean it. He has been absolutely essential. In addition, becoming his friend and partaking in the courtship that's led to what I'd absolutely call a bromance with this man has been one of the greatest things that's happened to me in my adult life. When my mother got sick in October, he texted or called me every single day through to her passing. Come to think of it, he hasn't texted me since. That's the kind of gesture that keeps your paddle in the water when the waves start getting real choppy. He's as good a person as I've encountered in my life, and his name, lads and ladies, is Dennis Diken.
What are we doing here today? What's going on?
Well, you are one of the foremost authorities on this band. I remember first hearing about you outside of the context of the Smithereens when getting together with Dominic Priori in the mid-90s, when he and I were talking about doing a Smile documentary, and we were talking about interview subjects, and your name came up again and again and again. You and I had never met, but you were at that point greatly ensconced on my radar as not just a musician in a band that I loved, but a true Mr. Know-It-All from the behind-the-scenes world.
Well, this is what I always say, because I get called to talk about different musical things for interviews and projects, and be it Joe Meek or the Four Seasons, Lovin' Spoonful, or the Beach Boys, and I really don't consider myself a know-it-all. I'm just a guy who really digs the music, and I'm really passionate about it. So I spent a lot of my life researching it because I dig it so much. But there's people that know a lot more about it than I do. But thanks.
Well, the kind of music that you make, it's quite apparent that this is a guy who loves music. Like there's chefs who come home from restaurants and they just don't want to cook because they've been at it all day. But it's quite obvious because your love of music comes through in the type of music that you play. And your liner notes, and you just having conversations with you, it can go on ad infinitum because that passion, obviously, that's what brought us together.
Yeah, the passion runs deep, and it started at a young age. It's the type of thing where, well, let me ask you, Dave, what did you want to be when you grew up? If I asked you that when you were 5, what would you have said?
A director.
And you become a director, right?
Yeah.
And so that's cool. That means, so you're in the same boat. If you asked me at age 5, I would have said, I want to play drums and I'd like to be a DJ. So we both have that same current running through us, that same thing that made us want to get out of bed when we were 5, 6, or 7. And it's still there. It's the same thing. So that's what puts us in the same boat.
Yeah, definitely. So I know that this is a period of great interest for you and you love this record. Before we actually get into the album at hand, let's catch up first on when last we'd seen our boys. So, by the way, we're at the beginning of 1964. And so at the end of 63, we have on December 21st, the show in Sacramento, from half of which the Beach Boys concert had gone down. Also, I don't know exactly what day it was booked, but a session was booked for January 1st, 1964, for the guys to go in and record some music. And the guys, they're sliding, I would assume, most cockily into the new year. They're the top band in the country. They'd released 4 singles in 1963. All those singles hit the top 10. Their Christmas single, Little Saint Nick, reached number 3. They were really on top of the world.
First of all, yeah, January 1st was the session for Fun, 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 right? I always thought that was weird. The day after New Year's Eve for musicians to go into a studio, because typically, characteristically, musicians play on New Year's Eve and people party on New Year's Eve. And what kind of shape would they be in on the first? But I guess they were such pros. Plus, Murry was still in the picture. So I guess he was cracking the whip. The other thing I wondered recently, now, we all know that, of course, within a few weeks, the Beatles were going to hit American soil and take over the country, the musical landscape, being that the Beatles and the Beach Boys were both on Capitol. And by late 63, Capitol had a promotional campaign. We really dug in and it was ready to launch in January. Got to wonder if the Beach Boys were aware of the Beatles even in late 63. And did that knowledge, if they had it, even kick their butt? Or had they heard their music at that point, too? I Want to Hold Your Hand was released in late 63. So I always wondered if that played into the energy of January 1st, 64.
You know, I always assumed that they kind of strode into 1964, kind of blindly assuming that they were very secure on their perch. And then when they got out to Australia and New Zealand midway through January, that all this stuff started happening and they were unaware because they were so cut off from everything halfway around the world. Yeah, so I never even considered that they were aware of the Beatles. I always felt that February came along and boom, all of a sudden they were both inspired and shaking. And then they head off to Australia and New Zealand as the support act to Roy Orbison. It's their first tour down under. It's worthy of noting that Mike meets a girl on the tour named Sandra Rice and has a whirlwind romance during which they actually discuss marriage, because at this point, Mike was completely libidinously out of control and had a real thing for the ladies. After they leave, apparently Brian is inspired to write Help Me Ronda about that experience.
Oh.
And also, let's talk about Murry. When they were out there, there was an experience which acted as the final rift to assist in prying Murry from the band in every which way except actually controlling the publishing. So Murry had been fining the boys if they used profanity. He would signal from the side of the stage with a T for treble up. That's something that David Marks talks about a lot. And he once walked right on stage in Sydney and turned down Brian's bass.
Really?
Yeah, because Brian actually really preferred low-end distortion, but Murry hated it. So by the end of the tour, everyone's in total agreement that Murray's going to have to get the heave-ho. They take a vote. It's 5-0. It's unanimous. Murray's got to go. So Brian fires him. After he's fired, he apparently not only stayed in bed for weeks, but just stayed in his pajamas. I mean, does that remind us of anyone?
Yeah, right. Child is father to the man.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I don't know exactly how long Brian actually did stay in bed, but this was kind of a dry run for Brian's seclusion. And I wonder how much of his response to being fired Brian was privy to. I know that part of the idea of pulling Murry out of it was Carl actually introduced him to the Sunrays. They were actually initially called the Renegades, and Rick Henn said, I think Carl saw it as an opportunity to get Murry off of their backs. He could see his dad was grieving, and he really needed something to do, so that's where we came in. So the Sunrays were just a way to pull him out of his downward spiral. And this thing wound up very quickly turning into him and Audrey splitting. I mean, I don't think it lasted for a long time, but they moved, they split. He wrote her that letter, which is really an uncomfortable read.
I don't know if I've read the letter to Audrey, you're saying?
Yeah. He's talking about how their sex life is dormant because she has sold her love for him down the river in order to focus on the boys. And it's made him feel like only a fraction of a man. And it's a real seriously uncomfortable read. And poor Audrey, I mean, in the session tapes, especially for Help Me Ronda, that whole time she's there. She doesn't say a single thing. Always constantly there and present and just observing the whole thing go down.
Right.
So Murry had an ulcer. He wound up selling his leasing company to devote his life to the boys and the band. And then he shows up drunk at the studio during Help Me Ronda and bullies Brian. There's a physical altercation. Brian pushes him down to the ground, apparently, and Murry leaves. But he did still manage the Sea of Tunes song catalog, however. He still controlled the song credits and still had influence over the band's future. And we're going to return to this in 5 years. So on February 3rd, 64, Fun, Fun, Fun comes out as a single backed with Why Do Fools Fall in Love. Fun, Fun, Fun winds up reaching number 5. And of course, it's worth noting because in the UK, when it's released the following month, it doesn't even chart at all. And soon they're seen as demigods over there. So they have a real quick ascension overseas. So February 7th, 64, the Beatles land at JFK. And February 9th, Ed Sullivan. 73 million people, almost all of them kids, tune in. You know, it's, I think, hard to keep it in perspective with regard to how it must have impacted the Beach Boys, because when I look back, you know, I see all the giants. It's the Beach Boys, the Beatles, the Stones, Dylan. I mean, those are really the big four, right? But then you bought me Mike Love's book. I hadn't read the book, and there were some things in there that really changed my perception about the story and the Beatles' introduction onto the scene. There's a passage in his book that really lays it bare and has stayed with me. And that is, you know, the perceived edge, at least the way the Beach Boys saw it, that the Beatles had over the Beach Boys. One of the things is that the Beatles understood film in ways that the Beach Boys did not. The Beatles had A Hard Day's Night, which has remained being perceived as a cinematic classic for decades to come. And the Beach Boys backed up Annette Funicello in a 1965 flick called The Monkey's Uncle, which was about a chimp. You know, and then there was the merch. The Beatles had T-shirts, stickers, posters, lampshades, dolls, lunchboxes, pinball machines, you name it. The Beach Boys, Murry had made buttons that said, I know Brian's dad, and he would give them out to people. The Beatles' bass drum head had a beautiful modern-looking logo emblazoned across it, and Denny's was blank. So when Mike lays it out like that, that comparison, it really makes me dying to hear some kind of microphone that was hot and left on where I could overhear the panic that they were feeling at that time to get a sense, because this rivalry wound up being A, one of the things that broke Brian, and B, one of the things that created some of the greatest art that history has ever bore witness to. You know, and it all started here. It actually, you could make an argument that it all started with I Get Around. With I Get Around, he topped the charts, and then it was on. Then the Beatles felt the competition. It all starts here. And this fuse is now lit. And it's one of the reasons why things get so exciting during this year. So February 17th, a session for the Honeys single, He's a Doll, which is released 2 months later. February 19th is session number 4, in which they do Keep an Eye on Summer and Pom Pom Playgirl, which means that it's a historic date, because February 19th, 1964 is Carl's very first Beach Boys solo vocal. And then February 20th, I believe this is the final. Yeah, February 20th is session number 5. So it's important to note, 5 total sessions for Shutdown Volume 2. That's not a lot of time. Brian is unhappy that the album was so rushed in the midst of such stiff competition with the Beatles, and even considers scrapping the LP and starting over. He actually thought about dumping this. Capitol puts that idea to rest, but over the next couple months, Brian and Mike begin taking things to the next level with an unprecedented writing spree and start pumping out tons of songs in a bid to compose the absolute best songs of their career. And on March 2nd, 1964, I don't know how this is possible, but only 10 days after the group finishes recording, the record's released.
It's crazy.
How's that possible?
Just insane.
I mean, how is that actually physically possible that they could have everything manufactured in time to have it in stores?
One thing I will say is that this happened with any number of records back in the day. You'll notice that the covers were probably already printed. Once they knew the song titles, you look at the back cover, and they would not have the running order necessarily. They would say C label for correct sequence.
Right.
So they had that in place, I suppose. Once they knew what the titles for sure were going to be for the songs on the album, at least that was wrapped up. I'm sure all the photography had been done and everything was good to go on that end. But yeah, it's wow. I know, it's mind-numbing to think what a quick turnaround that was. Just crazy.
So before we actually move into the record, let's explain that title. So Shutdown Volume 2, which probably was confusing then and is definitely confusing now. The name is intended to echo Capitol's various artists' non-Beach Boys Shutdown album, which was released in summer 1963, that had included, amongst a bunch of other songs, Shutdown and 409. And Volume 2 is promoted as a hot rod record, even though it includes only 4 car songs. Shutdown Volume 2 misses the top 10, but eventually does go gold. Brian, like I said before, not happy with the way it's turned out. He feels that the production is rushed and uncomplicated, and he knows, before it even hits shops, that the dialogue and filler tracks at the end of it make it peter to a close. But let's talk about this thing. So it's 27 minutes and 5 seconds. It peaks at number 13 during a chart stay of 38 weeks total. And important to note that it didn't even reach the charts for 6 weeks.
Wow.
Because of the Beatles. So those guys must have been kind of shaken all over. It's their 5th album, and it's also the first of 3 studio albums that the Beach Boys released in 1964. Also the first recorded without David Marks, who had departed the band, which, we had talked about the disagreements that he'd had and the fallout with Murry. And it's also the first album with Al Jardine on the cover and the first album with no David Marks at all. Although there's some claims potentially that he actually is on some of this. Also worthy of noting before we get into the track by track is the rediscovered master tapes.
Are you talking about the multi-track that was uncovered about, I guess by now it's 20 years ago or so?
It actually involved John Stebbins. The tapes were retrieved with his help. A fan had found and kept the tapes untouched for years. And then, of course, the ubiquitous Mark Lynette and Alan Boyd. I mean, anytime there's a Beach Boys tape that's found, I feel like squaw, like circling overhead, coming down. The Mark and Alan birds dive in for a landing. But because of that, there are these, stereo mixes of Fun, 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 Warmth of the Sun, Pom Pom Playgirl, and some really, really good crystal clear tapes and mixes that resulted. So you want to take us into track 1, side 1?
Sure, but I would like to add to what you just said about those multi-tracks that were discovered. In addition to those new mixes that we are enjoying, on that Keep an Eye on Summer digital release, we hear some great studio outtakes as well, which are a true treasure for fans to hear from the sessions that we're talking about for Shutdown Volume 2. It's so cool to hear them run through false starts and early takes on some of these tunes. And we'll get into that.
There's 2 outtakes from the Christmas album because as much as, I love diving into the detritus of any band, I like false starts and, session tapes and things like that. But when there's a real outtake to be discovered, like the 2 Christmas album outtakes, to me, that's true treasure.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a huge compilation, really worth hearing. I've heard it a number of times, and it's awesome.
Yeah. Besides Shutdown Volume 2, it includes tracks from All Summer Long and some of those All Dressed Up for School, a couple of different things. But it's a great glimpse into that year and to the way they worked in the studio. And not all, but most of those recordings were done with the group on their own instruments. Not a ton of wrecking crew. So it's really essential. It's the essence of the band. Just love that. I live for that stuff,
Yeah. And I don't know if you know this, but Ginger Baker credits, the extended versions of Toad that Cream does. He attributes that to the 45-minute Denny's Drums Redux that's on Keep an Eye on Summer.
Oh, okay.
All right, so fun, which honestly, going on a very long time now for me, it feels impossible for me to be objective about this song. I've heard it so much, and it's pretty much the template for the all-time driver's license kiddo freedom tune. It can't be beat for what it is. The only complaint that I have with regard to it is that I really only wish that coda with Brian's falsetto at the end where it peaks, I feel like the fade happens so quick, and I always want that to be a more extended section. I love that.
I love it too. It calls to mind when I was a kid and I'm 6, 7 years old buying Beach Boys records. But even at that age, it dawned on me that with every new 45 released by the band, they were growing. With every release, you looked forward to a new Beach Boys record because you knew there was going to be some yet unheard production value. I didn't know what production was, but I knew when I heard Fun, 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 and I heard that outro with the falsetto, it blew your head off. Because we already heard the single Surfing Safaris, Surfing USA, Surfer Girl, on, and they were all great. But when that record came out, it was so stratospheric. You just wondered how can they go on to top each single, but they did. That is a perfect example of a real leap. That cut is, I think, a true leap in production value and the band really congealing in terms of writing, arranging, performing, and recording. And I guess it's the first, maybe Be True to Your School. It was an example of Brian really flexing his Spector influences, but Fun, Fun, Fun really is an overt Spectorian tribute and inspiration, I would say. It's not the first, it's the first solid Wrecking Crew rhythm section, I guess, single by the boys. Maybe Be True to Your School. I'd have to go back and listen to the single version of Be True to Your School. That might be the first. But Fun, Fun, Fun really sounds like he's going for Da Do Ron Ron,
Yes. But also, I feel like it's a greatest hits of subsuming his influences into the fabric of their sound, because obviously the opening electric guitar introduction, we've got, some Chuck Berry, Johnny B. Good action, and then we've got the drum fills, definitely Phil Spector, the Do Run Run, the Wrecking Crew being present, and also potentially, I should say, dipping into the same lyrical well. And I say potentially because there are multiple possible sources from which the lyrics had apparently been derived. One story is that the lyrics are at least partly inspired by events from Dennis Wilson's life. And in my head, I'm always thinking of On the Road. I always think of Neil Cassidy and Jack Kerouac, where, Brian and Dennis are filling those vicariousness roles. I love the connections between those two relationships. And Mike Love would also reference in later interviews that the lyrics were based on Nadine by Chuck Berry. And then also, according to Salt Lake City radio manager Bill Hesterman of KNAK, who was an early promoter of the Beach Boys, it was inspired by an incident involving the station owner's daughter. Her name was Shirley Johnson, and she had actually borrowed her dad's 1963 Thunderbird, ostensibly to go to the library. Instead, she went to a hamburger shop, which back then was tantamount to truancy. And when that came to light, she had her driving privileges revoked. And in 2007, she was interviewed about it. And she was saying that she was complaining loudly about the incident at the station where she was working as a part-time secretary when the Beach Boys happened to be there for an interview. So apparently, Brian and Mike were really amused, and they started jotting down notes for the song. One thing that I want to note is that the origin of this song, it was not always fun. And we're now going to take a peek into a chat I had with Russ Titelman, one of Brian's best friends from this time. The two of them would always hang out together, and he would get priceless peeks behind the curtain. Here's Russ Titelman on the origin of fun. Russ, thanks for joining us. I know that as far as fun goes, you were kind of there right at the outset of things. In fact, it wasn't even called that at the time. Why don't you take it and just tell me the story of the origin tale of fun?
Okay, so Brian and I used to hang out. You know, we'd go to Pink's for a hot dog and then go up to his office, which was on the southeast corner of Sunset and Vine, catty corner across from Wallach's Music City. And he had an office up, you know, it was a modern office building. So, you know, he'd go over and he had a piano and he was playing me stuff. And then he said, I'm working on this song. And he played me Run.
Were the lyrics?
The lyrics were slightly different, but the main stuff was in there till her daddy took her T-Bird away. Within the run. And so she'll run till her daddy takes her T-Bird away.
Oh, that's great. So the lyrical thrust was basically there.
Basically the same, but he changed the words. You know, he made it fun.
Were you there?
And I guess he was right.
Yeah, I think so. So were you there when he changed the lyrics?
No, I don't think it was. But then he played me the finished song, you know, later. Yeah.
In his office?
I don't remember if it was in the office or not. Be True to Your School was out around the same time. And Help Me Ronda, I think, around that time. Am I right?
That came a little bit later.
Yeah, but not...
Same year, but back then,
right.
A lot was happening in a year.
Isn't that crazy? Isn't it crazy?
Yeah, it really was. I mean, you know, just to give you an insight into something that to me is just flummoxing. There was 1 month in December of 1964 where Brian was introduced to marijuana, literally smoked marijuana for the first time, got married, got his first #1 album, which was Beach Boys Concert, and had his first nervous breakdown. All in 1 month. If that's 1 month, I mean, because you guys, you know, had these impossible expectations on you in your career to produce things, you know, it was too much for people after the 60s. But during that time, I guess some people would be taking speed to keep up with that kind of hectic schedule, but not everybody was. You guys were able to manage it.
Yeah, I guess.
But, you know, when you were sitting in that office that day, burping up hot dogs, did you think this is a huge hit? Or did it not seem?
Oh, absolutely. You could tell. You could tell, of course, a smash.
So was he previewing all kinds of different tracks for you during that time?
You know what we used to do? We loved Jonathan Winters. So we used to sit and listen to the Jonathan Winters records and crack up and do the bits. Like he knew all the Marty Frickert bits and, you know, we'd sit and howl with laughter and do the bits.
Do you remember the last time that you guys hung out?
Well, I guess it was on the making of the solo record when we spent a lot of time together.
Right. Was that the last time you saw him was 88?
I saw him a couple of times after, but like, you know, backstage at something or...
So do you remember the last time you just were palling around in his office or, you know, during those days?
You know, the making of that record was when we were together in the studio. That's mainly how it went. You know, when he was working, he was fine.
So there you go. Run. There you have it.
Who would have known?
Who'd have thought? Could have even been licensed to Dick's Sporting Goods.
The other thing I love about this period, actually going back to 63, is how they would insert the word now at the end of a line. Well, you got to now, just a man now. And that goes back to 63. I forget a good example of it, but it's so badass. This whole track is just so badass.
Track 2 is an incredibly important song from my vantage point, probably from most Beach Boys fans' vantage point. Oh, hi, I'm Dave Gebrow. I threw my career as a licensed hearing instrument specialist in the trash, sold my house, and moved to the East Coast with my wife and 5-year-old son in order to focus on making the ultimate weekly podcast for music obsessives thrive. But weekly wasn't enough for me, so I bumped it up to 4 shows a week. Becoming a subscriber to Discograffiti's Patreon gives you access to hundreds of exclusive episodes. As a 2-show-per-week private, you get the weekly show by and for our Patreon family, the Discograffiti Soldiers of Sound podcast. As a 3-show-a-week lieutenant, you'll get early release, ad-free, extended director's cuts of the main show. They're the shows as they were intended to be heard. Plus, you'll gain access to half the Patreon archive and the upcoming Beach Boys Behind the Mirror companion episodes, which will feature dozens of special guests from within the Beach Boys camp talking about and rating their music. But as a 4-show-per-week major, you'll be drowning in a flood of must-hear binge listening, because I'll be bombarding you with episodes about super cool bands that are too subterranean for free Fridays. It's like going to music college, but with a tuition that makes all kinds of sense. Plus, our entire Patreon archive is yours. Discograffiti's Top 10, our Buried Treasure show, Rock Cousteau, our Slag Off show, Queasy Listening, and the Private Press with Paul Major. And all that for the price of only a cup of coffee a week. Times are tough, you say? Fret not, because there's a $1 tier. Or you could just join as a basic member and buy episodes piecemeal from our Patreon shop. Don't risk feeling badly about yourself by not giving. Check out patreon.com/discograffiti to find the tier that's right for you. Once again, that's patreon.com/discograffiti. Don't Worry Baby is the emotionally mature thinking man's Spector. Really, the most depressive thing about it is that it's a Spector-style song that's played just by the Beach Boys. I could talk for days on this song. It's on a whole other level. It's plaintive like The Lonely Sea, but so much deeper and with all kinds of heft that someone Brian's age should barely be cognizant of. In fact, I believe that this could have actually held a place on Pet Sounds and not felt out of place. In so many ways, it's really the direct emotional predecessor of that record. The playing field that we're dealing with, which is this drag race, is sung about, but then is so backgrounded that it really just becomes about the feelings, the overwhelming anxiety that the main character, or Brian, is feeling. And I love how that drag race concept, it just keeps getting backgrounded the further we go into the song until we don't even remember that there's been a race. It's just about this guy and how upset he is. And to me, that's the power of this song, is all these teenage obsessions like drag races and a lot of the things that ground it in that time period ineffably. This song pulls it out of that. It uses those devices, but then really just says sayonara to them and just gets trapped inside the feeling.
And of course, you know that this was submitted to the Ronettes, right? Yeah. And they ultimately rejected it, or Phil rejected it. I played with Ronnie Spector for a number of years, and for a couple tours, this song was in the set for her. So she admired it and she dug it. I always thought, even as a little kid, that the lyrics might have held it back. I guess I should have kept my mouth shut when I started to brag about my car. I love it, but I just thought that might have stymied its acceptance for other artists to do it.
Just to be clear, this was composed as an answer record, right?
As far as I understand, or as Brian's bid for the follow-up, the Ronettes' follow-up to Be My Baby. And it certainly takes musical cues for it. The motion of the melody in some cases, you could tell that he's trying to rewrite Be My Baby. And then when they recorded it, it's pretty skillful how they didn't mimic that drum beat that starts Be My Baby, but it's a version of it, but with a beat added to it.
Yeah.
So it's certainly very close in its flavor to it, but man, two different animals, really, but both incredible pieces of music.
He apparently got the song title when he was writing this. When I talked with Carney Wilson, she said that Don't Worry Baby was what Marilyn told Brian when he said, there's no way I can top Rubber Soul. But I think, with all due respect to Carney, I think it's mixing up another story, because I believe it was actually Marilyn, shortly after hearing Be My Baby for the first time, she told Brian in response to how he'll never be able to top this. She said that, and the way that dovetails into being the title of an Answer record, I obviously like that story better. So I don't know exactly which is true, but did you know that when he first came up with the tune, that he did it as a samba?
No, I never heard that. You mean like a bossa nova feel?
Yeah.
Is there any recorded evidence of that?
I don't know if it was recorded.
How about that? Well, it certainly was a big musical movement in late 63.
I've heard so many Beach Boys songs so many times that some of them, unfortunately, have ceased to have an effect on me. And there's nothing I can do about it. One of those actually is Fun, Fun, Fun. Where I've heard it so many times, I'm heard out on it.
Yeah.
And I'm hoping for that to change at some point, and perhaps it will. Don't Worry Baby, it's never happened to me. Same with Warmth of the Sun. I could hear it a limitless amount of times. Part of it is that lead vocal, which has got to be one of his 10 great performances. And I think he has said in interviews that this is possibly their finest record. I don't know if he has stuck to that as his outlook on this song, but this was the B-side to I Get Around, and this charted separately at number 24.
A lot of their singles were double A sides that had separate chart showings. So yeah, Don't Worry Baby, it did chart too. The instrumentation is so simple. And again, it's the group playing. It's just the band. There's no outside players.
That's amazing. I feel like it's some kind of a hot shit statement to do I wouldn't say necessarily a Spector pastiche, but a Spector callback, and yet not to use the musicians that you've been using because you're such a big Spector fan. One final thing that I have on this song that always seemed so conceptually interesting is I Get Around and Don't Worry Baby are like two sides of the same coin. And that coin is the very beginning of that sort of Trouble in Paradise thing. Although obviously there's a more melancholic mood going on with Don't Worry Baby than I Get Around, but I'm getting bugged driving up and down the same old strip. There's discontent there, and there's certainly a much more soured, more obvious and upfront version of that in this. And I Get Around is like so perfectly symbolic of the California myth in every possible way, shape, and form. And then Don't Worry Baby suggests something more dark, what we would be kind of leading into with the Beach Boys in the late 60s, and even other dark notions of the California dream that would follow suit at the end of the day. Also worthy of mentioning, vocals and guitars were overdubbed on January 8th or 9th, and that David Marks, who had left the group several months earlier, may have played at this session on overdubs.
Did he say that he might have played the stabs in the solo section?
I believe the chink, chicka, chink.
Blank, blank, blank.
Yeah. He is definitely rock solid on that having happened. And he has fantastic recall with this stuff. So yeah. I believe him. So lastly, in 1988, the Beach Boys re-recorded the song featuring the Everly Brothers and released it as a single. And they re-recorded the song with Lori Morgan for 1996's Stars and Stripes Volume 1. Then comes In the Parking Lot. So
yeah,
a Roger Christian co-write with Brian Wilson.
Did we note that Roger Christian co-wrote Don't Worry Baby too?
Oh, we did not, actually. Roger Christian plays a pretty important role in this record.
It's noteworthy that Roger Christian, one of Brian's favorite writing partners, was a DJ at a couple of the top LA radio stations. And legend has it they used to hang out late at night over milkshakes or ice cream sundaes and talk about music and co-write lyrics. I would have loved to have been privy to that.
I got to talk about those tom rolls.
Yeah, I was going to bring that up. That tom roll that Denny uses at the top of the song, you know what? I think on those session tapes that surfaced, I think he started an early take of Don't Worry Baby with that same tom roll, which he also used in Hushabye on All Summer Long. I think it comes up a few different places. That was one of those things that were lodged in Denny's bag of tricks. I used it a few times on certain recordings myself. But I love Roger Christian's reference, speaking of the car culture, it's not my metal flake paint that the guys are digging when they pass by now. It's such great high school imagery.
And another line that ends with the word now.
Right. Oh, it's all over the place now. Yeah. And what's cool about this track, the way it's bookended, it starts and it ends with that completely different tempo and vocal doo-wop kind of thing, just a wordless vocal motif that starts and ends this track.
I got to say that aspect, the harmony waves and the tom rolls at the beginning and the end, that is unquestionably my favorite part of the song. I always look forward to where it empties out and tumbles down into the first verse. And I always look forward to the ending, the way it wraps itself up and eats its own tail. And on top of that, the do-ron-de-ron-day background vocals are just, it matters what you say, not just how you say it. In those doo-wop vocals, it must be so much fun to come up with a nonsense phrase to say in the background of these doo-wop style songs.
Yeah, they love that. And, it's kind of smacks of Dion a little bit, the posture on this song and the swagger. I like this as much as any Beach Boys track. Some people put it down. I love it. I love In the Parking Lot. I love what it represents. I love the way they were still able to tap into the high school lifestyle and making out in the car. It's so tough and badass. And there's plenty of adventure to the way the song moves, and the composition of it. I just dig this. You know who really dug this song a lot too was Andy Paley, our friend who passed away recently. He was a big fan of this tuning and he loved this album. I mean, I think he counted it as among his favorite Beach Boys albums, and I'm with him on that too.
All right, the all-important Cashous Love versus Sonny Wilson. A mock battle between Brian and Mike. And my favorite thing about this track is that it's just so interesting to contrast the playful fighting with the very real tumultuousness that wound up characterizing their relationship as time moved on. And although it's the definition of filler, the self-effacing way that they treated themselves at that time on record was novel in the music world. And one other point is that texturally, it gives Warmth to the Sun an extra dramatic kick by being placed brilliantly directly before it. But what's kind of unexcusable is this is the longest track on the entire album.
I never realized that. You know what's interesting too? I looked at all the writing credits before we spoke today. And whereas the ones that were collaborations between Brian and Mike usually say Brian Wilson, Mike Love, this one says Mike Love, Brian Wilson. Mike's name is first.
You're right. That's interesting.
Isn't it, though?
I did not notice that, but yeah, there it is.
Yeah, and I don't know, that might be a one-off, but let me say this right now. I know it's filler, it's construed as filler, but I live for this shit. When I was a kid, when I was a young boy, and I know I speak for a lot of Beach Boys fans, these spoken tracks on their albums, there's our favorite recording sessions and Bull Session with the Big Daddy. Man, those tracks were like manna from heaven because it gave us a glimpse into each guy in the group, their speaking voices, their personalities. It helped us form a spiritual kinship with them as people. Oh my God. Because, back then you didn't have YouTube at your fingertips, and it was rare to see any of your artists on a TV show, let alone hear them speaking. You saw them either performing or lip syncing to a song, but to get an idea of what their personalities were like, to make them come alive in your mind, man, this was the coolest thing. And I still get a huge kick out of listening to those spoken tracks on their albums. And so, yeah, it's filler, I guess.
I got to hand it to you. As far as all those sessions go, all of the spoken word attempts that they had, this is my favorite one because at least in this, there's a central conceit. It's them making fun of one another. The other ones, there's no real thrust or narrative to them, just audio verite. This is, at least there's a point to it.
Yeah. I always wondered, why did they end that little snippet of In My Room with the weird chord? But that's neither here nor there.
Yes, that's the part that I always look forward to. I love that they have a twist on the...
Yeah, it's like, why? So, but you're right. It leads into Warmth of the Sun in such a drastic change.
The dynamic is so perfect. There literally is nowhere else to sequence this but before Warmth of the Sun, which, of course, has got to be in their top 10 songs of all time and one of the most outstanding ballads ever composed. Whether it's about the president or a one-night stand over whom Mike was overly fixated, this song is as moving and powerful as anything that's ever been written. Of course, the real argument is, was this song written before John F. Kennedy was assassinated, like the night before leading into that day, or was it done retrospectively directly after his assassination? This has been a debate that's been going on in Beach Boys circles for decades, and everyone's got their story. Mike Love says that, and I'm going to read from his book here, The Warmth of the Sun was started in the early morning hours of the same day that President Kennedy was killed in Dallas. The melody was so haunting, sad, melancholy, that the only thing that I could think of lyrically was the loss of love when interest slips and feelings aren't reciprocated. Though I wanted to have a silver lining on that cumulus nimbus cloud, so I wrote the lyrics from the perspective of, yes, things have changed and love is no longer there, but the memory of it lingers like the warmth of the sun. I think it's really impactful and memorable. One of my favorite songs from an emotional and personal point of view. And I will say, by the way, these are Mike's best lyrics he's ever written. There's no question he never wrote any lyrics that were as moving, as powerful as these. But just to go to the alternate side of things, in the book, I Am Brian Wilson, Brian in 2016 recalled that the song was written the day of the assassination in response to it. Brian wrote, when the shooting happened, everyone knew instantly. It was all over the TV and on every kind of news. I called Mike and he asked me if I wanted to write a song about it. I said, sure. It seemed like something we had to think about, and songs were the way I thought about things. We drove over to my office, and in a half hour, we had The Warmth of the Sun. We didn't think of it as a big song. It was a personal response, but it got bigger over time because of the history linked to it. And then, of course, Fred Vale has his account where at the end of a concert, he comes to their hotel room with paper bags filled with $6,000 and empties the bag's contents out on one bed while Mike and Brian are writing the song on another bed in response to, so this is after Kennedy had been assassinated that night. But the way Mike writes it in his memoir, it was about this girl that he really had a thing for that he met in Hawaii, and she just didn't feel the same way about him. And then there was just a way to use those lyrics as a prism through which to perfectly encapsulate the experience of JFK. Where do you stand on the whole thing?
Mike told me that story personally, that it was based on an incident with a girl in Hawaii. Any way you slice it is kind of cool. If they wrote it in response or in the aftermath of JFK's assassination, it's quite poignant that they were able to distill that into this tune, that feeling that I remember that day very well, too. I totally remember the day in November. I remember they sent us home I remember we were at recess. I was going to St. Elias Catholic School. I only went there for kindergarten and first grade, and I went to public school after that. But I remember we were in Catholic school, and it was recess. And I was hanging out with some friends, and some kid ran up and said, "You hear that they shot President Kennedy?" And my initial reaction was, as a 6-year-old, I said, "You can't shoot the president. What are you talking about? That's impossible." And then we went inside the school and watched TV, and they sent us home early that day for half day. But anyway, if they were able to put that mood into that song, well, kudos. But if they somehow sensed something in the air prior to the incident, I wonder if somehow in the early morning hours of November 22nd, 63, if they somehow had an antenna to a change in the air that was to happen that day.
That's the story I want to be true.
Yeah, right? Yeah. Who knows? Either way, it's pretty cool, that they were able to capture that mood and that mindset and that emotion and put it into that song.
And it's that chord change. I'm no musicologist, but that really weird chord change, which is saved from being unusual and bizarre by the melody that Brian lays on top of it. But it was apparently, a chord change that had not really been used, and in other hands would have been a sort of experimental, strange change.
That progression starts off as a pretty boilerplate 50s progression. Then it takes a turn. It kind of takes you into familiar territory at the outset, and you're kind of comforted by that. And then it just pivots, man, to that, whatever chord that is. And it's, I've never done drugs to speak of, and I've certainly never experienced heroin, but the downbeat of that record where the group vocals come in, even if you didn't have Brian's falsetto, just the downbeat of the backing vocals always gives me this feeling of warmth and of beauty and majesty and comfort. More so on the mono and the initial stereo mix, not so much the remix where the vocals are not as prevalent. And of course, Brian's falsetto adds a lot to it too. But that downbeat feels like the sun, the sonic qualities of what the sun brings to us. It's something that's captured so beautifully on that recording and in that song. It's if you put a gun to my head, this might be my favorite Beach Boys song.
Yeah, I can understand that. I'm going to have to go with I Just Wasn't Made for These Times, but this is in my top 5. And there is, without question, a synesthetic aspect of this that definitely does feel like the sun. The vocal and the progression and the mood that it conjures because of the melody, all of it contributes to an overall feeling of the nutritive properties of the sun, the dazed quality that you get from laying in the sun all day, and also that perfectly balanced, searching, mournful quality. Brian only equaled it. He never really topped it because you can't really top that.
Right. Good way to put it. Yeah. And I feel that way with a lot of instances of early versus later recordings by groups like the Beach Boys and the Beatles. They never got better. They just got different. The other thing I'll say about this is interesting is that it's Denny on drums and Hal Blaine on percussion.
What is the percussive aspect going on?
I think Hal is either adding a ride cymbal and a wood block, or maybe just a wood block on the 2 and 4 when Denny is playing a side stick. It's subtle, but actually the wood block gives it some definition. But it's interesting. There's a couple tracks, including Hawaii, where it's Denny on drums and Hal on percussion. And I don't know if that was intentional or Denny was doing a good enough job, and as he did on so many of their recordings, and that aspect gets overlooked a lot too. Denny Wilson played on tons of some of the best Beach Boys sides, and that gets forgotten with history being rewritten. So many times you read that the Wrecking Crew played on all the Beach Boys, but the Beach Boys didn't play on their own records. It's almost like saying Bernard Purdy played on the Beatles record. It's just the more you read it, people start to believe it. But I maintain this. I think Brian always wanted the group to play on their records as much as possible. And some of the early sides, Our Car Club, for example, was intended to be a Honey's track. Rabbit's Foot, it morphed into Our Car Club, so it included the Wrecking Crew playing on it. But I think Brian really liked the band playing on the records. And it was only his outside productions, I believe, that he focused on hiring outside players. He retired from the road, of course, that he hired studio players. And some of the productions got more involved where he required the ensemble orchestral knowledge and acumen of those players that he started working with them more.
It's a very simple concept as to why history was rewritten, because documentaries like 20 Feet from Stardom and, the Wrecking Crew movie and a few others that are kind of similar in tone as far as clarifying some aspects of musical history, sort of to redress the balance in a way that tipped the scale way too far. The other side, so that you forget that the actual group sometimes did just fucking fine on their own. Not to discredit what the Wrecking Crew brought, because if you take all their contributions out, you're pulling out some of the greatest music ever made. But the Beach Boys were far more involved than one is led to believe by some of these important documentary works.
No, I agree. You're right. It's a point well taken. The way Brian and a lot of artists were starting to make music and compose and arrange required, number one, more players than the five guys. And keep in mind that Carl Wilson did play guitar on a lot of the sessions where the other Beach Boys weren't present, but the Wrecking Crew, like California Girls, for example, that's Carl doing the guitar intro, maybe in concert with another player, but it's predominantly Carl on that. And of course, the Wrecking Crew members are the orchestra on that. So it was two different entities that were very vital to the whole canon.
Yeah. And another way that you know that The Warmth of the Sun is the command performance that it is because Murry covered it on his Many Moods record. If you didn't know, now you know.
He couldn't deny that one, right?
Right, exactly. It's got to be the best song on the record. I would say for sure it's the best song on the record. And it's followed by what I would call a somewhat mid-tier Denny deep cut. This Car of Mine, not a bad song, but it's certainly not The Warmth of the Sun as far as the emotional movement that occurs in it. But it is helpful to notice that even when the group is on their version of what passes for cruise control, that they're still better than 95% of all the other bands in existence. This song's got like a nice mellow saunter that carries it through, but it's, one of the lesser tracks on the record.
And it's funny how Warmth of the Sun is in the sandwich between those two type of tracks. And it just puts Warmth of the Sun on such a pedestal, I guess you would say. But I love this Car of Mine. Denny's vocals, man. Was it every album? Did he have a lead? I'm trying to remember if he had a lead vocal on the Surfin' USA album. That might be the one they skipped early on. Kind of like, oh, let's give Ringo one, let's give Denny one. But Denny had a soulful, cool voice and had that kind of Dion attitude. This one almost smacks a little bit of the Wanderer, the shuffle feel. And
he was thrown a huge frisbee on Today, to open and close the record like that. And really my favorite aspect of this song is his vocal. His vocals are great on this Car of Mine.
Yeah, really cool. That's one of the other things that's so wonderful about the Beach Boys. 5 cool individual voices. They all had their own thing to say vocally, and then put them together, and you get that beautiful wash too.
This episode is brought to you in part by Bespoke LA. Located in the Fairfax district of Los Angeles, Bespoke LA is the modern podcaster's dream come true. It's got 2 podcast pods available, one with audio only and the other with both audio and video. Just think, you can start your own podcast tomorrow without investing a single penny in equipment. What, you don't have experience editing? Don't even sweat it. For an additional fee, Bespoke LA can edit your podcast. Or not, it's entirely up to you. Rates start at $75 an hour with discounts if you book 4 sessions at once. Go to bespokela.com/podcast. That's BSPOKELA.com/podcast for more information or to book your time today. And be sure to tell them that Dave sent you for a one-time 25% discount. All right, so now we're on side 2. We've picked up the needle. We've placed it ever so delicately black down on the black platter. And Why Do Fools Fall in Love? Originally a top 10 hit for Frankie Lyman and the Teenagers in 1956. And this is a cover that I particularly enjoy because of the tricked out production. And one thing I believe you and I kind of run counter on is John Stebbins' multi-tracks that he brought to the table wound up being pretty important from my vantage point, because there's this heavily Spectre-esque epic intro that I believe really should have stayed in the final version. I believe you can hear it on the Keep an Eye on Summer compilation, thankfully. And what I like about it is it's California Girls-like in its separateness. You know, I love how it kind of wanders in from somewhere else and winds up into the song, just like California Girls. It, to me, is not a call back, but a call forward to California Girls. And I really do wish that that was kept in. It seems like a lot of work went into that to then toss it aside.
Well, I do disagree. I love it for what it is. I don't think it fits on this song at all. And I don't think it quite compares to the California Girl intro, because that has a very logical connection from where that piece ends and lopes into California Girls. This is a complete separate entity that is great unto its own and could have launched another tune. I don't know if you know this, but there's two mixes of it. There's the one that's on the LP, which starts with that gunshot snare hit, which to me is really perfect, the way it just kicks that song into being. The 45, the B-side of Fun, 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 doesn't have that shot, but it has a little organ trill and a vocal, just a little wordless vocal underneath Mike's vocal intro. And I think both of those serve the song better. It was a revelation hearing that Leon Russell, I believe, plays the piano on that intro piece we're referring to. A great discovery. It was a real ear opener to hear that, wasn't it?
Yeah.
But for my money, both of those mixes, the one on the 45 and the one on the LP, are where it's at for Why Do Fools Fall in Love. But Why Do Fools Fall in Love, to me, is monolithic. I don't even know if it was intentional or not, but the way it was finally rendered in the mix, there's something very, very striking about this track. Of course, this is the Wrecking Crew on this one, and I don't think any of the boys played on this. Interestingly, Hal Blaine's drum part hints at, or is a variation of, what would be the drum beat on Good Vibrations. The track is stark. When they added the vocals and it was mixed with that Gold Star echo chamber, it sounds like it was cut in a cathedral. It's just something very almost mystical and holy and forward thinking. It seems like there's forward motion to this production to me, and to the way the end product came out. There's something very different and cool about this. I think it was a major achievement and very, very different than the original version by Frankie Lyman.
I definitely love the song, not quite as much as you, because my excitement only gets heightened with the next two songs. You know, because the thing is, the originals that he was creating get me so much more pumped than the remakes, but I love the song. It's an incredible piece of work. Then we have a historic tune, Pom Pom Playgirl, because it's the very first solo lead vocal that Carl ever did.
That's right.
And I love it because it's just filled with all these super weird sounding chordings, and it all sounds experimental. And then there's that stop-start construction to it that's so cool. And then somehow it always passed me by that this is only a minute and a half long.
Yeah.
Which is crazy to me because it's stuffed with incredible touches. And I have no idea how Brian got around to all of it in that kind of time period. And again, when we talk about, you know, the nonsense syllables that are hanging out in the background of the doo-wop songs, Chi-Chi-Wah, Pom Pom Playgirl, I love how they settled on Chi-Chi-Wah. I mean, that's got to be half the fun of doing a song like this. Also love the really weird reverbed out timpani or drum hits.
It sounds like a timpani to me. It sounds like it, yeah.
And then at the end, the Ladder to the Heavens series of key changes as it keeps building and building up. All of it is unbelievably super inventive, and I definitely think it's one of their craziest early songs, and about such a mundane topic to have a crazy song about.
Agreed. I think there's such adventure to the music in this. Like you said, it kind of leaves you breathless at the end of it.
Co-written by Gary Usher.
Right. And this might be one of the last of the Usher co-writes from that era. It's almost like a funhouse ride. You're going through all these twists and turns, and then all of a sudden it's over, you know? And I love the lyrics are great. Since she's the head cheerleader, she dates the quarterback, and her best friend's going out with the fullback. She might even run for an office this spring, and that would really make her telephone ring. That's great, man.
Yeah,
So cool. The cherry on top is that on the fade when young Carl goes, wave those pom-poms all around. Wow. It's so cool. Go, Carl.
Amazing. You know what it really reminds me of is Robert Pollard, because Robert Pollard from Guided by Voices was never one to hammer a riff to death. He was never one to overcapitalize on an exciting musical discovery that he'd stumbled upon. And this has that kind of quality in spades, where Brian could have tried to capitalize on a lot of these things that he had come up with and somehow left them all alone as these singular experiences to go through. And like you said, be spat out of that ride in record time. And that's kind of half the impressiveness of it, is that it's over so quick, and the gigantic leaning tower of musical uniqueness that comes with this song. I can't point to any other abstract weirdo, except if you're talking about like Zappa, if he's like thumbing his nose at straight society. There's nothing that is like this. Pom Pom Playgirl is unique unto itself as a straight weirdo song about high school culture.
Yeah. And as it says on the back cover of Shutdown Volume 2, it really moves.
Yeah. So cool that this is the first solo lead vocal Carl ever did.
I know. I guess prior to this, it was a duet with David Marks on Summertime Blues on the first album. Well, a lot of folks think it might have been Girl Don't Tell Me, but in fact, it's Pom Pom Playgirl.
Yeah.
So cool, man.
And then one of my favorite early Beach Boys non-single deep cuts is unquestionably Keep an Eye on Summer, which is a Bob Norberg co-write with Brian Wilson. And I got to say, some of those collaborations that Brian did with Bob Norberg is some of the greatest music I've ever heard in my life, including, I know this is going to be a song that I mentioned throughout this whole series, but if you haven't heard Thank Him, which is on the 1963 Big Beat copyright extension compilation, you absolutely have to hear it. It's spectral in its ghostly intensity, and Keep an Eye on Summer has that sort of feel to it. It's just this drop-dead gorgeous song, heartbreakingly yearning. I think this should have been a single. I really do. And I know it's something that stayed with Brian, unless it was recommended by Joe Thomas, because it appeared on his 1998 Imagination solo LP.
Oh, okay.
Sort of adult contempo twist. And unfortunately for me, this is kind of where the album ends. And we'll talk about that. But talk to me about your relationship with Keep an Eye on Summer.
Well, I agree. I think it's criminally overlooked. I don't know why it doesn't get referenced more or played more. It's one of their best cuts, period.
It also dips into that standard summer juice well that all their best, most classic material comes from.
Yeah, it's almost like, Sealed with a Kiss lyrically. It's got that longing quality to it.
Now I want you to take me by the hand and treat me with some respectful condescension and explain to me why the last three songs should be regarded on the same level as the rest of the record. And this is coming from a guy who loves the Beach Boys and doesn't even mind their filler.
I wonder if they felt compelled to get this album out because the Beatles were hitting before they could come up with more original material. Because, boy, when you talk about from when the last session was completed, which you mentioned before, I forget the date, to the release date of this album was just a few weeks.
10 days.
Yeah. Wow. So they must have felt that they were really in competition with the Beatles and had better capitalize on the success of Fun, Fun, Fun and get this out. Yeah, the last three songs don't stack up to the greatness of the rest of the album, I would say. But keep in mind, this is not the last time that an album had maybe not as much of what you might construe as filler, because All Summer Long, keep in mind, had Carl's Big Chance, a great instrumental, but still an instrumental, you could probably think was the placeholder, and then Our Favorite Recording Session. So there's two tracks on that album too.
But Carl's Big Chance is the best of Carl's surf instrumentals. It's the last of the surf instrumentals, and it's the best one. My favorite of these three tracks is Shutdown Part 2. I like Mike's sax work on it. Man, is that a honker. I mean, the way he attacks it. Yeah. It's a Carl Wilson writing credit, right?
Yeah, that's right.
That's interesting. Otherwise, I don't really know what to say about it. You have anything to say about this one?
I love the count off, the backwards count off at the top by Mike, and those horn blasts, which are almighty with that reverb. I mean, it's quite striking. So that is the only connection that I can hear to the song Shutdown, because he's reprising, in his own words, his primordial sax solo on Shutdown. So that's what that is. The rest of the song, I don't think musically bears any resemblance to the song Shutdown. I could be wrong, but I think it's a nifty little tune. It's got two drum tracks on it, by the way, and that's Denny, and it's a one track with an overdub drum track. It's actually a cool little invention. And I don't know if that's taken from a previously released track. It's not a throwaway. It's actually a cool instrumental.
It is decent.
Yeah, it really is.
I wouldn't say the same thing about Louie Louie. This is the squarest version of this song that's probably ever been recorded. And you'd never know that they were on the road acting like animals, notwithstanding Brian, of course, but the rest of the guys with this super well-behaved, not a single hair out of place kind of take on, what was really like the progenitor of punk. I really don't like their version of Louie Louie.
What you probably don't know is that what they're doing here is they are appropriating the original version by Richard Berry. If you listen to Richard Berry's version, they're going for the guitar feel that's on the original R&B version. So it has no connection whatsoever to the Kingsmen's take on it. They're going for the original seminal version of Louie Louie here. So it's not really square. It's actually very authentic.
Okay.
And Mike's vocal is pretty snarling and pretty great. And the solo is bitchin' on this. And also the dun 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 is taken from the original Richard Berry version. So there's no correlation between the garage rock take on it.
I guess that's, my main complaint is comparing it to something it's not trying to be. But my associations with Louie Louie are not a well-behaved version of Louie Louie. I think of it as the essence of sloppy, beautifully sloppy, majestically sloppy. And this is just so well-behaved that I believe it's stuff like this that made people think that they were just the goody two-shoes kind of act when they really weren't.
Yeah, but listen to the vocal again, man. The vocal is not goody two-shoes at all on this. Mike goes in some pretty cool territory on this, especially on that last verse. I love it. Yeah, I don't rank it amongst my favorite Beach Boys tracks, but I don't rank it amongst my least favorite either.
It's the only song on this record that I really wish wasn't on it.
Okay.
Because I can deal with Shutdown Part 2. I think it's kind of cool. It's not as good as The Warmth of the Sun, obviously. And Denny's drums, it's a cool outro. Now, I know Denny's drums, this is a big one for you.
So it was February of '64, and in Carteret, New Jersey, where I grew up, the grocery stores sold records. The A&P and Lebo's Food Town sold records. We didn't have a record store in town. You had to go to Two Guys Department Store in Woodbridge or S. Klein's, which is where I bought Fun, Fun, Fun. So I would go, when my dad on a weeknight would go grocery shopping, I would tag along in hopes that I could coerce him or beg him to buy me a record. And this one time we went to A&P, I think I already had the Fun, Fun, Fun single, but had not seen Shutdown Volume 2 until this day. And I'm looking in the racks, and there it is, the beach. And I love the cover of Shutdown Volume 2. It's very informal. They're just hanging out with their rods, and they just look tough, man. They look like what I wanted to be when I grew up. And I'm looking at the song titles, and there it was, Denny's drums. I was an aspiring drummer at age 7. I wanted to play. I had sticks that Mrs. DeFilippis from across the street gave me, but I didn't have any real drums at the time. Beach Boys were my favorite band, and it dawned on me, their drummer's name is the same as mine. Holy moly. So yeah, Denny's drums looms very large in my history. And I think it's a really cool track. And I think it, again, like Cashous Love, it gives you just a glimpse into the personality of one of the members of the band. The track has got swagger to it. Nobody else could have played this besides Denny Wilson. It's, in fact, portions of it, he's kind of riffing on Dick Dale's surfing drums. Yeah, maybe to the average listener, it's a throwaway, but to me, it was Godhead. And I even got to perform this a few times. I got to play this with David Marks. Not that he played on it, but he was sharing the stage with me. But yeah, I think it was obviously part of the Rush job ethos of this album, but it was kind of ballsy for Brian to allow it to happen. I guess you also hear on the session tapes that came out that the first stabs at this had guitar on it and some cymbal crashes. It was a different animal, but then Denny finally arrived at what I think is a more suitable performance. I get why people think it's a throwaway, but I've said my piece.
Yeah, look, my favorite thing about it is your relationship with it. When you first told me about how this was a big thing for you, it kind of changed my relationship with the song because I had zero associations with this song before meeting you and becoming friends with you. And the fact that it was such a propulsive component of your entree into the music world and, you know, such a beacon, it changed it for me. By no means a great song for me, but that there is the end of the album. And, you know, on the CD, you have the single version of Fun, 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 the German version of In My Room. And then the only one that bears speaking about is the Brian Wilson, Roger Christian co-write I Do, which we had talked about the Castells releasing in March of '64. The melody was derived from County Fair, which was written and performed on Surf and Safari. And I think I Do is one of the great Beach Boys songs that never was. I believe it was unfairly given to the Castells, and I think that I Do, how that wasn't on this record is amazing to me, to think that some of the things that wound up on here got on here and I Do didn't.
I think it was a thematic decision. I think casting the Beach Boys, a teenage group with a teenage fan base, much like when the Beatles first appeared on Ed Sullivan, they showed individual shots of each member with their names, and it came to John, it was underscored with "Sorry girls, he's married." I don't know if you've ever seen that or noted that, but the thinking was back then, hide your wives, hide your girlfriends. We want the girls to desire the Beach Boys. You can't put a wedding song on a Beach Boys album.
Yeah.
And that's what this is.
Yeah, it's just intense. It's an intense song about marriage, explosively emotional.
It's great.
So powerful to me. Well, anyway, let me give you my short little capsule review of Shutdown Volume 2. To think that this is the product of 5 total days in the studio is enough to electrocute my feeble little brain. That doesn't even seem possible. Pom Pom Playgirl just by itself should have taken 5 days. This one typically gets a bit lost in the shuffle, coming as it does before All Summer Long. And when I think about the transition fulcrum point that goes into part 2 of the Beach Boys, I think of All Summer Long, even though this is part of that transition. And it's a transitional album for the Beach Boys while they were doe-eyed watching the Beatles wrest the crown from their heads. But notwithstanding the last 3 tracks, most of it's as good as anything they ever did. Even the fumble at the end is entertaining enough. The guys get plenty playful and plaintive and gave the Mop Tops a pretty fair run for their money here. Although rarely the one I wind up reaching for whatever reason, it always sounds so incredibly good when it's on. And I'll give this one 4 3/4 stars. And that's only because of the last 3 songs and the fact that it just, to me, just obviously falls apart.
Okay.
It kills me to not give it 5. I can barely sleep at night, honestly, knowing that somehow this isn't a 5. I want to overlook the last 3 songs, but for me, it does fall apart a little bit. So 4 3/4.
I get it. For me, it's a 5-star just personally. I think it was the first Beach Boys studio album that I owned, too. I had Concert first. I don't have to quantify it in any way except that I love it, and it's 5 stars for me, and I get why those tracks notch it down a bit for most people, but it's one of my favorites. That's just me.
That's why this is your episode, my friend.
That's right, man.
That's exactly why.
Yeah. To add just a footnote to Denny's drums, the way it was inspirational to me, I got to think it held the same feeling for a lot of other aspiring drummers and musicians when it came out. The fact that one of the members could step out stark naked like that and play his instrument, I think spoke to a lot of kids too. And another aside, if you look at the photos, portray them, the front and back photos, as just these dudes, they don't look like rock stars. They just look like guys you went to high school with. And I love the picture on the back where Brian is not looking at the camera. If you look at the photo on the back cover, he's got this smile on his face. He's just looking to the side. There's just so many things to love about the whole package. Yeah, it'll always loom very, very large in my life. I'm really glad to have gotten the chance to speak about it. And I hope there's a lot of folks out there that share my feelings about it. And I'm sure there are.
It's definitely my favorite of the 2 Shutdown records.
Although the Shutdown album does have Ballad of Thunder Road by Robert Mitchum is on Volume 1.
Oh, nice. All right, so heading out of Shutdown Volume 2 territory and heading into All Summer Long territory, America is now in a full-on Beatles stranglehold. Brian truly feels like he swung at bat and missed at a key moment in their tale. That Shutdown Volume 2 truly was his bunt instead of a grand slam, as Smiley Smile would become known for, and he wasn't about to let that happen again. It was time to slow down the process and be a hell of a lot stricter about filler. If he was being asked to forfeit his championship belt, he wasn't about to go down without a fight that he fought using everything he had. Shutdown Volume 2 did not represent all the arrows he had stocked in his quiver, and it was now time to hunker down and give the Fab Four a real run for their money. That legendary Wilson competitive spirit rises to the top, and Brian is ready to go head-to-head with the Fab Four coming up right around the corner on All Summer Long. I don't even know what to say, my friend. This thing, I really don't know. It would certainly be a very different beast, this series, if it was not for you. I owe you so much. I don't even know where to start. I just want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. You're going to keep appearing through the series. I know you're going to be poking your head in during all the different seasons and even during some of the upcoming interviews. And I'm really looking forward to that because it's just always great to have you on the program.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be a part of this, really. And I really hope that this series opens ears, young listeners and older listeners who maybe have not stayed with the band and would like to revisit the music and gain more insight into what made them tick and the heart and soul of their music. I think it's important to keep this alive, to keeping the summer alive.
I can say with great certainty that the series has been, as of this taping, has been running for 10 days now, and there's a lot of people listening. I'm getting great feedback. To me, it's a treat to get to talk about my favorite band of all time. To me, this is the reward at having worked so hard at setting the show up for 3 years. I take these chunks of time to focus exclusively on the world's greatest band.
Yeah, well, there's always something to be learned too. Don't you find that in the process?
So much.
Yeah. I mean, it's remarkable that you'll be talking to some of the people that are on tap. It's the real gift.
Yeah. I love you, buddy.
I love you too. Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right, that about does it. Stay tuned because next week we've got an episode about the Beach Boys All Summer Long LP featuring special guest, author John Stebbins. Okay, here's the week up ahead. This Sunday, our weekly show within a show, the Discograffiti Soldiers of Sound podcast, drops for our Patreon's private tier. These are real people with talent and a burning fire deep inside, just like you and I. Then come Monday, the major tier gets a very special treat as we delve deep into the Beach Boys' truncated yet intriguing foray into film. It's an episode about the Annette Funicello American International flick Muscle Beach Party, which houses a soundtrack by Brian Wilson created during the All Summer Long period, and guiding us through will be none other than the inimitable Dominic Priori. Don't miss this one, or you'll only be getting part of the story. And then on Wednesday, the Lieutenant tier gets their early release, ad-free, super extended director's cut of the All Summer Long podcast with John Stebbins. It's the episode as it was truly intended to be heard, with all the essentials left intact. And then come Friday, everybody else gets to join in on the action. A heartfelt Discograffiti thanks goes out to my beautiful wife and son, Jen and Mason, Dennis Diken, Rudy Fishman, Becky Boyd, Jay Schultz, Bespoke LA, my mom, my dad, Joe Kennedy for that killer new theme song, my incredibly loyal fans, and especially the entire Patreon community, the Soldiers of Sound. I love every last one of you, and this show would not exist without you, my friends. Speaking of friends, it's high time for some new ones. They're in our Facebook group, Discograffiti Soldiers of Sound. That's the best way to find out what's coming up on the show, but there's a hell of a lot more. You get recaps of the day in music history, the ability to pitch questions to guests, polls that put you in the driver's seat on guest and band decisions, access to a thriving creative hub if you're looking for a collaborator, and much, much more. So make sure you don't miss out. You can find the link to the Discograffiti Soldiers of Sound Facebook page right there in the show notes. And if you don't mess with the Zuck, no sweat. Just email me at info@discograffiti.com and I'll keep you in the loop. So now that it's done and you want more, another way to dive even deeper into classic rock and roll from the 1960s is to leap headfirst into the Righteous Brothers Bill Medley interview, that's 181 and 182, my interview with the Free Design, that's 160 to 162, my epic interview with the Mamas and Papas Michelle Phillips, that's 141 to 159, Blood, Sweat, and Tears, that's 137, my 12-hour interview with Terry Kirkman and Jules Alexander from The Association, that's 109 to 113, Vashti Bunyan reading her entire output, that's 103 to 104, Sergio Diaz from Os Mutantes, that's 86 and 87, Bert Summer, that's 83 and 84, Sweetwater is episode 79, a tribute to David Crosby, 77 and 78, Andrew Tuttle rates the Monks, 74, Jim Florentine on Black Sabbath is 64 to 68, Lou Barlow on the Zombies is 59 and 60, Marvin Gaye biographer David Ritz rates Marvin Gaye, that's 45 to 47. Blind Faith is 43. Anthony Fantano rates the Velvet Underground, it's 32 and 33. Bob Forrest rates the band is 25 and 27. Monkees manager Andrew Sandoval rates the Monkees, that's 22 and 23. Don Randy rates David Axelrod as 17. Badfinger is 16. The Bee Gees is 10 and 11. Sly and the Family Stone is 5, 6, and 7. And Pink Floyd is 1 and 2. And of course, be sure to mark your calendars, because next Friday, March 7th, we're coming at you with All Summer Long and John Stebbins. Trust me, you're not going to want to miss it. And so, from now till then, don't let our youth go to waste, lads and ladies. It's Discograffiti!